The sterile walls of St. Jude's Hospital had seen thousands of faces, but none were as overlooked as Audrey Hart. To the arrogant chief surgeon, Dr. Sterling, she was just the maid in scrubs, a clumsy older hire, good for nothing but changing bedpans and taking insults. He laughed at her silence. He mocked her trembling hands. He had no idea that those same hands had once held the lives of Special Forces operators together inside burning Black Hawks over the Hindu Kush. He thought he held all the power until the day the glass doors shattered, not from an explosion, but from the roar of a Navy Seahawk descending right onto his helipad. They weren't looking for a doctor. They were screaming for the nurse he just fired. The rain hammered against the sliding glass doors of the emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center, a rhythmic drumming that usually soothed Audrey Hart. Tonight, however, it was drowned out by the sharp, stinging voice of Dr. Gregory Sterling. "Hart, for God's sake, are you mopping the floor or painting a masterpiece?" Sterling's voice boomed across the nurses' station, causing two younger residents to snicker behind their clipboards. "We have a trauma incoming in 10 minutes. Try to make the floor less of a death trap, would you?" Audrey didn't look up. She kept her eyes focused on the scuff mark on the linoleum, her grip on the mop handle tightening just enough to turn her knuckles white. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice soft, devoid of emotion. "Unbelievable," Sterling muttered loud enough for everyone to hear as he turned to Brenda, the head nurse who functioned more as his personal cheerleader than a medical professional. "HR sends me geriatric washouts when I ask for trauma specialists. She's 40 if she's a day, and she moves like she's underwater." Brenda laughed, a shrill sound that grated on Audrey's nerves. "She's just slow, Dr. Sterling. Some people aren't built for the pace of a level 1 trauma center. Maybe she'd be better off in the cafeteria." Audrey squeezed the mop into the yellow bucket. The dirty water swirled dark and murky, much like her memories, though she kept those locked away behind a steel door in her mind. She wasn't slow. She was deliberate. Every movement she made was calculated to conserve energy, a habit ingrained from 72-hour shifts in dust-choked field hospitals, where wasted motion meant wasted seconds, and wasted seconds meant death. But here in the pristine, fluorescent-lit world of civilian medicine, her economy of motion was mistaken for lethargy. Her silence was mistaken for stupidity. She wheeled the bucket toward the utility closet, passing the trauma bay, where Sterling was preening in front of the residents. He was a tall man, handsome in a superficial way, with a jawline he clearly admired in the mirror every morning. He was a competent surgeon, technically speaking, but his ego took up more space in the room than the gurneys. "Listen up." Sterling was lecturing, gesturing with a scalpel he hadn't used yet. "In trauma, you are gods. You decide who lives, who dies. You don't hesitate. You don't flinch. Unlike some staff members who flinch at the sound of a dropped tray." He cast a derisive glance toward the closet where Audrey was stowing the mop. Earlier, a metal tray had clattered to the floor, and Audrey had instinctively dropped into a low crouch, scanning the perimeter. It was a reflex, a PTSD tic she hadn't managed to kill. To them, she looked like a frightened rabbit. Audrey exited the closet, smoothing her navy blue scrubs. She walked over to the patient chart rack, hoping to find a simple laceration or a fever to tend to something to keep her away from Sterling's orbit. Brenda interjected, stepping in front of the rack. "Dr. Sterling needs his coffee, black 2 sugars, and check bed 4, the drunk guy threw up again. Clean it up." Audrey looked at Brenda. The woman was younger, perhaps 30, with perfectly done makeup that somehow never smeared during a 12-hour shift. "I'm a registered nurse, Brenda, not a janitor. The janitorial staff is on break, but I can call. I'm the charge nurse." Brenda snapped, her smile vanishing. "And I'm telling you to clean bed 4. Unless you want me to write you up for insubordination again, I'm sure the board would love to hear how the new hire is refusing direct orders." Audrey held Brenda's gaze for a second. In that second, a flash of something cold and dangerous flickered in Audrey's eyes, the look of a woman who had once stared down a warlord in a negotiating tent in Kandahar. Brenda blinked, taking a half step back, suddenly unsettled without knowing why. Then the mask slid back into place. Audrey lowered her eyes. "I'll take care of it." "Good," Brenda said, her voice shaking slightly before she regained her composure. "And hurry up. The multi-car pile-up is 5 minutes out." As Audrey walked toward bed 4, she checked her watch. It was an old, battered G-Shock, starkly different from the Apple Watches the other nurses wore. She tapped the face. 5 minutes out. She knew what that meant. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the static electricity that preceded chaos. She had felt it in Fallujah in Syria, in places that didn't exist on official maps. She pulled the curtain around bed 4. The patient, an elderly homeless man named Silas, whom the staff usually ignored, looked up groggily. "Sorry, darling," he slurred, wiping his mouth. "Sick as a dog." "It's okay, Silas," Audrey said gently, her voice changing instantly from the monotone she used with the staff to a warm, soothing tone. She worked efficiently, cleaning him up, checking his vitals, and adjusting his IV flow rate, which someone had set too high. "You're dehydrated. That's why the nausea is hitting you. I'm slowing the drip. You'll feel better in a moment." "You're a good one," Silas mumbled, his eyes closing. "Better than the loud guy in the white coat. He scares me." "He scares himself, Silas," Audrey whispered, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "Rest now." She stepped out from the curtain just as the red lights above the bay doors began to flash. The ambulance bay doors hissed open, letting in a gust of wind and rain. "Showtime, people!" Sterling shouted, clapping his hands. "Let's see if we can save some lives despite the support staff's incompetence." Audrey stood by the wall, invisible, waiting. She knew the storm wasn't just outside. It was walking through the doors. The ER exploded into controlled chaos. 3 stretchers were wheeled in simultaneously by paramedics who looked drenched and exhausted. "Multi-vehicle collision on I-95, the lead paramedic yelled. "We have a 45-year-old male unrestrained driver, blunt force trauma to the chest. A 20-year-old female passenger, severe lacerations and possible internal bleeding. And a child, years old, unconscious, vitals dropping. I'll take the driver in Bay 1, Sterling barked, rushing forward. "Resnick, you take the girl in Bay 2. Brenda, get the kid to Bay 3 and Page Pediatrics, tell them to get down here yesterday." The room became a hive of shouting voices, ripping Velcro, and the shrill alarms of cardiac monitors. Audrey moved to assist Resnick in Bay 2, but Brenda shoved her shoulder. "Not there, Hart. We need gauze and saline in Bay 1. Go be a runner. Don't touch the patients." Audrey didn't argue. She ran to the supply room, grabbed armfuls of saline bags and trauma pads, and sprinted back to Bay 1. Sterling was shouting orders at a terrifying speed. "BP is crashing. He's got a tension pneumothorax. I need a needle 14 gauge now." Audrey handed the needle to a resident, who fumbled it in his nervousness. The needle clattered to the floor. "You idiot!" Sterling roared. "Get another one!" The resident froze. The patient on the table was turning blue, his trachea deviating to the left. He had seconds before his heart stopped from the pressure building in his chest. Audrey saw the resident's hands shaking. He couldn't open the packaging of the new needle fast enough. Sterling was busy trying to intubate and couldn't reach over. Without thinking, Audrey stepped in. It was muscle memory. It was instinct, honed by a decade of keeping soldiers alive in the dirt. She didn't grab the needle the resident was struggling with. She reached into her pocket, where she kept her own trauma shears and a spare decompression needle, a habit she couldn't break. In one fluid motion, she stepped up to the patient's right side, palpated the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, and drove the needle in. A sharp hiss of escaping air filled the small silence of the bay. The patient's chest heaved. The color began to return to his face instantly. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a steady rhythm. Audrey taped the catheter in place and stepped back, her face blank. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. The resident stared at her. Brenda stared at her with her mouth open. Slowly, Dr. Sterling looked up from the intubation. He looked at the needle sticking out of the patient's chest. Then he looked at Audrey. His face turned a shade of purple that matched the bruises on the patient. "What did you just do?" Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with rage. "He was crashing, doctor," Audrey said calmly. "The resident was compromised. Tension pneumothorax relieved. SATs are rising to 94. "You—" Sterling stepped away from the table, ripping his gloves off. "You are a nurse. You are a geriatric nurse. You do not perform invasive procedures in my ER. You could have killed him. I saved him," Audrey said, her chin lifting slightly. "He would have arrested in 10 seconds. I don't care if you turned water into wine," Sterling screamed, stepping into her personal space. He loomed over her, using his height to intimidate. "You are unlicensed for that procedure in this facility. That is assault. That is malpractice. You are a liability." "Dr. Sterling, the patient is stable," Resnick called out from the next bay, trying to defuse the situation. "Shut up, Resnick." Sterling spun back to Audrey. "Get it. Out." Audrey blinked. "Doctor, get out." Sterling pointed to the automatic doors. "You are fired. Immediately. Get your things and get off my floor before I have security throw you out. I will make sure you never work in a hospital in this state again. You're done." The entire ER was watching. The paramedics, the other nurses, the patients who were conscious. Audrey looked around. She saw pity in some eyes, satisfaction in Brenda's. She felt a familiar weight in her chest, the weight of injustice. But she had swallowed worse things than the ego of a civilian doctor. She unclipped her ID badge. "Fine," she said softly. She placed the badge on the metal tray next to the biohazard bin. "Good luck with the shift." She turned and walked away. The walk of shame. She could feel Sterling's eyes boring into her back. "And don't expect a reference," Sterling shouted after her. Audrey pushed through the doors into the waiting room, the cold air hitting her face. She walked past the confused families, past the security guard, who gave her a nod, and out into the rainy night. She stood under the awning of the hospital entrance, the rain soaking the bottom of her scrub pants. She reached into her pocket for her car keys, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She was unemployed. She had rent to pay. She had tried to live a normal life, a quiet life, and she had failed. Maybe I am broken, she thought. Maybe I don't belong here. She was about to step into the rain toward the parking lot when a sound made her freeze. It started as a low thrumming, vibrating in the soles of her sneakers. Then it became a rhythmic beating that rattled the windows of the hospital behind her. It grew louder, deeper, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Rotors. But this wasn't the standard medevac chopper that brought trauma patients. The medevac sounded like a lawnmower, high-pitched and whiny. This sound was heavy, aggressive. It was the sound of raw horsepower and military-grade turbine engines. Audrey looked up. Out of the storm clouds cutting through the rain, with searchlights blazing, a massive dark shape descended. It wasn't heading for the helipad on the roof. It was coming down right in the middle of the hospital parking lot, blowing cars' suspension down and sending debris flying. It was a Sikorsky MH-60 Seahawk. Dark grey paint. No medical markings. The wind from the rotors nearly knocked Audrey over. She shielded her eyes against the grit. The side door of the helicopter slid open before the wheels even touched the asphalt. Inside the hospital, the ER staff had rushed to the windows. Sterling, Brenda, and the residents were pressing their faces against the glass, watching in confusion. "What is that?" Brenda asked, her voice high with panic. "Is it a crash?" "No," Sterling said, frowning. "That's the Navy." Two figures jumped out of the helicopter. They were dressed in full tactical gear, multicam uniforms, drop-leg holsters, communication headsets. Not doctors, soldiers. They sprinted toward the ER entrance, ignoring the security guard who was cowering behind a pillar. Audrey stood her ground. She recognized the walk. She recognized the urgency. The lead soldier, a towering man with a thick beard and the rank of Master Sergeant visible on his chest patch, saw her standing under the awning. He skidded to a halt 10 feet away. He looked at her wet scrubs. He looked at her tired face. "Audrey!" the soldier roared over the sound of the rotors. "Audrey Hart!" Audrey straightened up, her posture shifting instantly from the fired nurse to something entirely different. "Sergeant Miller." The soldier ran up to her, breathless. "Thank God we found you. We tracked your phone." The hospital doors slid open behind Audrey. Sterling and Brenda came running out, followed by security. "Hey!" Sterling shouted, trying to regain authority over the chaotic scene. "You can't land that thing here. This is private property. I'm calling the police." The Master Sergeant didn't even look at Sterling. He kept his eyes locked on Audrey. "We need you," the sergeant said, his voice desperate. "It's the colonel. He's been hit. Bad. Private sector doctors can't stabilize him. He's asking for the ghost. He's asking for you." Sterling froze. "The ghost?" Audrey looked at the sergeant, then back at the helicopter. "I'm not active duty anymore, Miller. I'm a civilian. I just got fired." The sergeant stepped closer. "Audrey, it's Reaper. It's Sullivan. He took 3 rounds in a training op gone wrong. He's got maybe an hour. He won't let anyone else touch him. He said, 'Get me heart, or let me bleed out.'" Audrey's heart stopped. Sullivan. The man who had carried her out of a burning convoy in Aleppo. The man she owed everything to. She looked back at Sterling. The doctor looked small now, insignificant. "I need a flight suit," Audrey said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "On the bird," Miller said. "Let's go." Audrey took a step, then stopped. She turned slowly to face Dr. Sterling. The rain dripped from his nose. He looked terrified of the soldiers of the helicopter, and suddenly of her. "Dr. Sterling," Audrey said, her voice clear. "You were right about one thing." What?" Sterling stammered. "I don't belong in your hospital." She turned and sprinted toward the helicopter. The interior of the MH-60 Seahawk was a deafening, vibrating world of steel and shadow. A world Audrey Hart had not inhabited for 5 years. as the helicopter banked sharply, leaving the city lights of the hospital far below. The transition within her was almost physical. The slouch she had adopted to appear non-threatening to the hospital administration vanished. Her spine straightened. Her eyes, usually cast down to avoid confrontation with Brenda or Dr. Sterling, now scanned the cabin with predatory alertness. Sergeant Miller handed her a headset. She slid it over her ears, the roar of the rotors dampening to a dull hum, replaced by the crackle of the comms loop. "Sitrep Miller," Audrey said. Her voice over the intercom was unrecognizable from the soft-spoken nurse who had just been fired. It was hard, commanding, and stripped of all pleasantries. Colonel Sullivan was leading a training exercise with a partner unit from the SAS near the coastline. Miller explained, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "Live fire drill. Something went wrong. A ricochet or a misfire, we don't know yet. But a 5.56 round entered the lower abdominal quadrant, clipped the hip bone, and fragmented. He's got shrapnel near the spine and significant internal hemorrhaging." Audrey closed her eyes for a brief second, visualizing the anatomy. "Who is working on him?" "We have a field medic, Corporal Jenkins. He's good, but he's 22 and he's shaking." Sullivan refused medevac to the VA. He said. Miller paused, looking at Audrey with a mixture of reverence and fear. He said, "Find the ghost. If I'm going to die, I want her to be the one to tell me it's time." "He's not going to die." Audrey said the statement, not a hope, but an order. Miller pointed to a duffel bag secured by cargo netting near her feet. "We grabbed your old kit from the storage unit you authorized us to keep, and a flight suit. Can you change?" Audrey didn't hesitate. Modesty was a luxury for civilians. In the dim red tactical light of the cabin, she stripped off the stained baggy blue scrubs that represented her months of humiliation at St. Jude's. She kicked them into the corner like a shed skin. She pulled on the olive-drab flight suit, zipping it up to her neck. She laced up the tactical boots. When she turned back to Miller, Audrey Hart, the nurse, was gone. Sitting in her place was Lieutenant Commander Rhett. Audrey Hart, call sign, Ghost, the legendary trauma specialist, who had rewritten the field manuals on damage control resuscitation during the darkest days of the Desert Wars. "ETA?" she asked. 6 minutes. We're taking him to the Naval Air Station. They have a sterile trauma bay in Hangar 4, but the local surgeons are standing down. Sullivan threatened to shoot anyone who touched him before you got there. Audrey let out a short, dry laugh. That sounds like him. Stubborn old mule. She opened the medical kit Miller had brought. Her hands, which Dr. Sterling had mocked for being shaky, moved with fluid, terrifying precision. She checked the laryngoscope, the scalpel blades, the hemostatic agents. Everything was exactly where she had left it 5 years ago. "How bad is the blood loss?" she asked. "Class 3 shock. BP is 80/50. Heart rate 130. He's conscious, but barely." "Get on the horn to the ground crew," Audrey commanded. "I want 4 units of O-negative warmed and ready. I want a cell saver set up, and tell them to clear the room of anyone who doesn't have a star on their shoulder or a scalpel in their hand. I don't want an audience." "Copy that, Ghost," Miller said, a grin breaking through his beard. "God, it's good to have you back." Audrey looked out the porthole. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the lights of the approaching airfield. Below, she could see the flashing lights of a convoy waiting on the tarmac. For months, she had been the maid in scrubs. She had let Dr. Sterling berate her. She had let Brenda assign her the worst tasks. She had done it because she thought she wanted peace. She thought she wanted to leave the blood and the noise behind. But as the helicopter began its aggressive combat landing, flaring hard and dropping fast, Audrey realized the truth. She didn't want peace. She wanted to be useful. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the electric hum of purpose in her veins. The wheels slammed onto the concrete. The side door flew open. "Go, go, go!" Miller shouted. Audrey leaped out into the rain, sprinting toward the waiting ambulance that would take them to Hangar 4. She didn't look back at the city. She didn't think about St. Jude's, that life was over. The mission had begun. The trauma bay inside Hangar 4 was a stark contrast to the gleaming white-tiled ER at St. Jude's. It was industrial smelling of jet fuel and antiseptic. The lighting was harsh halogen suspended from steel beams. In the center of the room, surrounded by nervous-looking military medics and a terrified civilian doctor who had been brought in from the base clinic, lay Colonel James Reaper Sullivan. He was a large man, a mountain of muscle and scars, now pale and sweating profusely. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Audrey burst through the double doors, Miller right behind her. The room went silent. The civilian doctor, a man named Dr. Aris, stepped forward. "Who are you?" "We need a vascular surgeon, not another." "Step away from the patient," Audrey said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. She walked straight to the gurney. Sullivan's eyes were half closed, but when he saw her, a weak smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Took you long enough," he wheezed. "Traffic. Bad." "I had to take out the trash first," Audrey said, grabbing his wrist to check his radial pulse. It was thready, barely there. "You look like hell, Jim." "Feel like it," he grunted. Audrey turned to the room. "I need an ultrasound fast exam now. Jenkins, get that blood hung. Pressure bag, squeeze it in. Aris, you're on airway. If he stops breathing, you tube him. Do not mess it up." Dr. Aris bristled. "Now listen here. I am the ranking medical officer on this base. And I am the person keeping him alive," Audrey snapped, not even looking at him as she cut away Sullivan's uniform with trauma shears. "If you want to compare ranks, we can do that later. Right now, if you don't secure his airway, I will have Sergeant Miller remove you from this room. Physically." Miller took a step toward the doctor, his hand resting on his sidearm. Dr. Aris swallowed hard and moved to the head of the bed, grabbing the ambu bag. Audrey focused on the wound. It was ugly. The entry wound was just above the right iliac crest. The exit wound. There was no exit wound. "The bullet is still inside," Audrey murmured. "Miller, probe." She grabbed the ultrasound wand and pressed it against Sullivan's abdomen. The screen flickered to life. Dark fluid filled the abdominal cavity. "He's bleeding out internally," she announced. "The fragment nicked the common iliac artery. We don't have time for a scan. We have to open him up. Here, now." "Here," Dr. Aris squeaked. "This isn't a sterile operating theater. The infection risk. The infection won't kill him because he'll be dead in 3 minutes from exsanguination," Audrey yelled. "Scalpel." A young medic slapped the scalpel into her hand. "Jim." Audrey leaned close to Sullivan's ear. "I'm going to have to put you under. Ketamine and propofol. You're going to wake up sore, but you're going to wake up. Do you trust me?" Sullivan looked at her, his eyes clearing for a moment. "With my life ghost. Always." "Push the drugs," Audrey ordered. As Sullivan's eyes drifted shut, Audrey took a deep breath. She blocked out the noise of the rain on the hangar roof. She blocked out the smell of fuel. She visualized the anatomy beneath the skin. She made the incision. A midline laparotomy extending from the xiphoid to the pubis. Blood welled up immediately, dark and angry. "Suction," she commanded. "More laps. Pack it. Pack it." Her hands moved in a blur. She reached into the abdominal cavity, her fingers working blindly through the pool of blood to find the source. She felt the tear in the artery. It was jagged, pulsing weakly. "I've got the bleeder," she said, her voice calm. "Vascular clamp." She clamped the artery. The immediate flow of blood stopped. The monitors, which had been screaming a low-tone warning, began to settle. "Pressure is stabilizing," Jenkins called out. 90 over 60. "Okay." Audrey exhaled. "Now the hard part. I need to suture this. The fragment is wedged against the lumbar vertebrae. If I move it wrong, I paralyze him." For the next hour, the hangar was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and Audrey's quiet commands. "Forceps, 50 proline, retractor." She worked with a delicacy that defied the brutality of the environment. She dissected the tissue around the artery, removed the jagged metal fragment that was pressing dangerously against the nerve root, and sutured the vessel wall. It was a surgery that would have been difficult in a Mayo Clinic operating room with a full team. Audrey was doing it in a hangar with a field kit. "Suture complete," she whispered, releasing the clamp now. She released the metal clamp. She watched. No blood leaked. The pulse in the artery was strong and rhythmic. "Flow is restored," she said. "He's pinking up." A collective sigh went through the room. Sergeant Miller slumped against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. Even Dr. Harris looked at her with wide, stunned eyes. "That was," Harris stammered. "I've never seen a repair like that. The speed, the technique." Audrey didn't answer. She began closing the abdomen, her stitching neat and efficient. "Get him ready for transport to Walter Reed once he's stable," she said, finally stepping back and stripping off her bloody gloves. "But he's out of the woods." She walked over to a metal sink in the corner and began scrubbing her hands and arms, the water turning red. She looked at herself in the polished metal reflection. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with sweat, and a smear of Sullivan's blood on her cheek. She felt exhausted, but she also felt alive. "Ma'am." She turned. It was Sergeant Miller. He was holding a satellite phone. "It's General Holloway, from the Pentagon. He wants a status report. And he wants to know why the hell you were working as a janitor in a civilian hospital." Audrey dried her hands on a paper towel. A cold, hard look entered her eyes. "Give me the phone," she said. "And Miller. Yes, Ghost. Get the helicopter ready again. Once I talk to the general, I have some unfinished business to attend to." "Back at St. Jude's?" Miller asked, a knowing look on his face. "Back at St. Jude's," Audrey confirmed. "Dr. Sterling fired a nurse tonight. I think it's time he met the commander." St. Jude's Hospital was in a state of meltdown. It had been 2 hours since the black helicopter had lifted off, taking the incompetent nurse and the mysterious soldiers with it. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere inside the ER was electric, with confusion and fear. Dr. Sterling was pacing the nurse's station, trying to project an air of authority, but his hands were shaking. He had been fielding calls from the hospital director, the local police, and the FA for the last 90 minutes. "I'm telling you, I don't know who they were," Sterling shouted into the phone, his face red. "They trespassed, they destroyed 3 cars in the parking lot, and they kidnapped a staff member." He slammed the receiver down. Brenda was sitting at the desk, scrolling through her phone. Her face pale. "Dr. Sterling," she whispered, "you need to see this." "Not now." "Brenda, I have to figure out how to explain this to the board." Greg, look. She shoved the phone in his face. It was a TikTok video. It had been filmed by a teenager in the waiting room through the glass doors. The caption read, "WTF, Navy SEALs raid hospital to save nurse." The video was shaky, but the image was clear. It showed the helicopter landing, the massive soldier jumping out, and the interaction with Audrey. It showed Sterling shouting, looking small and impotent, next to the giant Master Sergeant. But the most damning part was the audio. The teenager had been close enough to the door to catch the sergeant's shout. "It's Reaper. He's asking for the ghost. He's asking for you." The video already had 2.4 million views. "Read the comments?" Brenda said, her voice trembling. Sterling squinted at the scrolling text. User 77. OFG, is that Audrey Hart? My dad served with her in Kabul. She's not a nurse, she's a legend. User Marine/01. The ghost. That's the angel of the Koran Gol. She saved my whole platoon in 2018. Who is the idiot doctor yelling at her vet life? That doctor is Dr. Gregory Sterling at St. Jude's. He's toast. You don't disrespect a Navy Cross recipient. Navy Cross, Sterling whispered, the blood draining from his face. That's impossible. She's a temp. She dropped a tray of instruments this morning. She was faking it, Brenda said, realizing the horror of her own complicity. She was laying low, and we treated her like dirt. Suddenly, the automatic doors of the ER slid open. But it wasn't a patient. 4 men in dark suits walked in. They moved with a synchronized, shark-like efficiency. Following them was a man in a crisp navy dress uniform, 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders. Rear Admiral Halloway. The ER went dead silent. Even the patients stopped moaning. The Admiral scanned the room, his gaze landing on Dr. Sterling like a laser designator. He walked over his footsteps, echoing on the linoleum. "Dr. Gregory Sterling?" the Admiral asked. His voice was polite, but it carried an undertone of immense danger. Yes, I am the Chief of Surgery," Sterling stammered, straightening his white coat. "If this is about the helicopter, I have already filed a complaint with the police. It was a reckless endangerment of my facility, and I'm not here about the helicopter," Halloway interrupted calmly. "The United States Navy will reimburse the damages to your parking lot." He stepped closer, invading Sterling's personal space. "I am here about Lieutenant Commander Audrey Hart." Sterling swallowed. She was fired for incompetence. She performed an unauthorized procedure.